So in this video, we're going to introduce the idea of fiscal policy, which is one of the two different stabilization policy types that we're going to be examining in this course. The other one we're going to be examining is monetary policy, and that's in Unit 8. And monetary policy comes from the word money, which is the idea of changes in the money supply by the central bank. And these changes are usually going to produce a change in the real interest rate, which would lead to a change in consumption and a change in investment. So we're going to re-examine all that stuff in the next unit. Now this unit we're looking at fiscal policy, and fiscal policy comes from the Latin word fiscus, actually, which is like a money purse or a little money bag, a little pocketbook or a wallet that you would carry around. And the idea here is that the government has a certain amount of money that it can spend, or it can tax, or it can transfer to other people. So there are three things that are components of this toolbox, and they are spending, taxes, and transfers. Now, before we get into the weeds a little bit of thinking about stabilization policy and types of it, it might be useful to consider that, should we at all do this? Should we do this? And there are a small but a vocal minority of economists, and also a much larger group of folks who are more in the political world, who would argue that this is probably not a thing, right? We shouldn't do this, that it is a thing that happens, but we shouldn't be, because it exacerbates the very business cycle that we seek to smooth out. So that is usually led by the no's, right? The no would be somebody whose name, if you look him up, his name is F.A. Hayek, or Friedrich Hayek. And in class, I talked about him a little bit more to explain kind of his point of view. We will return to his perspective in Unit 8 because it makes sense maybe to examine him more holistically. But for this purposes, for this unit, we are letting Mr. Keynes rule in the sense of John Maynard Keynes. So the yeses, right, the yes column would be led by John Maynard Keynes. And so these two individuals are kind of two pillars in terms of economics and thinking about economics, because they're answering a central question here. Should we have stabilization policy or not? Now, let's assume for a moment that we say yes to that answer, and that we have decided we're not going to use monetary policy for this time. We're going to use fiscal policy. Excuse me. And so now let's get into the weeds of different kinds of fiscal policy. There are really two ways of thinking about it. There's expansionary and contractionary, and the goal here is to increase aggregate demand, and the goal here is to decrease aggregate demand, or we could just say output, parentheses, output, Y. Now, with expansionary policies, these are ones that will happen often during a recession. So we'd say you would use this, use in a recession. Right? Use in a recession, and you would use these in an expansion because you'd want to expand the economy. Now, there's different types of fiscal policy on the other side as well. You have automatic and discretionary fiscal policy. This is sometimes called automatic stabilizers, because the idea here is that these types of things are pre-existing programs and laws that kick in automatically, right? Automatically when you're in a recession or when you're in an expansion. So, for example, if you think about it, a progressive income tax system, a progressive tax system would actually do this. And the more progressive your system, the more it actually does this. That if you have a recession, people's incomes are going to fall, and then they pay proportionally less in taxes. And so that has the effect of increasing consumption spending and smoothing out the business cycle. So again, a progressive income tax system is a good example here. And it does the same thing down at the bottom. If you're in a boom cycle, people's incomes are rising rapidly, taxes proportionally will capture more and more of their income, and thus kind of smooth out the business cycle and smooth out their ability to see higher incomes and have higher consumption. So it would reduce consumption. Another example of automatic stabilizers would be welfare payments and transfer programs, like housing assistance, food stamps, unemployment benefits, cash assistance. All of those kinds of programs would generally fall into the category of automatic. Now, discretionary ones, on the other hand, are ones where we're changing the law, we're changing programs. Maybe we're adding a new program, a new government program, so G goes up, or we're cutting taxes, so we'd say taxes go down and therefore consumption goes up, or we would say we're going to raise transfers, and so that would also increase consumption. So these are, again, new programs, new laws. You'd say we're cutting taxes, we're raising taxes, we're cutting programs, we're cutting transfers. Now we're going to draw a quick picture of what these might look like. So first we're going to start with the economy in an expansion and in a recession. Now, I'm just going to show you a picture here for a second, and I do this in class as well. Without all the lines labeled on here, you should, at a glance, be able to tell whether this is a recession or this is a recession, and whether this is the expansion or this is the expansion. Okay. Now, let me give you the hint as to how you can do it. This is output down here, and you have Y full, right? Y full, and then you have the actual level of output, Y1. Y1. And that's defined by aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply, LRAS, and so forth. I'm going to leave off the labels on here for just a second because it's easier to spot it. If Y full is greater than Y1, or that is to say Y1 is less than YF, that means our actual level is less than the full. So we are in a recession. Hopefully you're able to guess that one, recession. On the other hand, if Y full is greater than Y1, or sorry, I can't read. If Y full is less than Y1, that is to say our actual output, Y1 actual, is bigger than the full level, then we actually are in an expansionary gap or an inflationary gap. So that dictates to us what sorts of policies we should use. So here's a quick test question. Right? If we were in the picture on the left and I were a member of Congress, give me advice. What should I do? Well, I have some choices. I want to expand the economy, so I should cut taxes, right? Cut taxes. Let me make that arrow a little bit clearer. And that would have the effect of increasing consumption. Or I could directly increase government spending, or I could increase transfers. And all three of those, right, that one would increase consumption. All three of those would boost aggregate demand and ideally boost it right back up to the level of full employment. On the other hand, for an expansionary gap, what advice would you give me here? So you would say maybe cut government spending, which would directly affect aggregate demand, or raise taxes, which would reduce consumption, or cut transfers. Well, that's a good way to lose my job if I'm a legislator. So that would reduce consumption as well. So last part of this is an idea of issues with fiscal policy. And this one, there are 4 of them. There are 2 that are really important. They're the last 2. So we're going to put stars next to those. The first is called time lags. And there's 3 types of time lags. One is realizing the gap exists. So figuring out that we actually are in a recession. 2 is it takes time for the government to develop and pass a law. Getting politicians to agree on anything these days is difficult. Imagine talking about something like taxes and spending. And 3, it can take time to actually implement and spend the money, right? If we're going to build a new road, you have to do an environmental assessment, you have to plan, you have to buy the property, you have to go through a lawsuit with eminent domain. I mean, oh my goodness, it can take a long time. So all told, this can be a lag. And so you might want aggregate demand to be boosted really fast in a recession. So sometimes this takes time. The second is that, and this may despoil your innocence a bit here, politicians can manipulate the economy to their electoral advantage. In translation, they might cut your taxes to get your vote. They might be doing that not because we're in a recession, but just because they want to get your votes. And that actually could be bad for the economy, right? We're using fiscal policy just because we want to get reelected. Ooh, that's not a good thing. So we have to be careful of using that, and that's something that occurs in most countries with democratic processes. The last 2 are reasons why, right? Reasons, and I'm going to put this over here, reasons why AD might not increase as much as you think. Might not increase as much as you think. As much as you think. And this is the idea of saying if we were to increase government spending and cut taxes, and we're the government, we're going to fix a recession. The government is going to borrow money to do that. Now, when the government borrows that money, it's going to vacuum up, right? Think of a well, right? Imagine a little well. We're going to even draw one over here. A well, right? A well. We'll build a well. A well, and in that well, right, you have a little thing that lets you pick up, we're going to draw a little picture here, a little well, and it lets you get water from the well, right, the water. And as someone gets water from the well, it reduces the amount of water that's available for everybody else. Now the government, when they borrow money, they're borrowing that money, that's less money available for someone else. Water equals the loanable funds is actually what we call this, loanable funds. And so there's less loanable funds available for everybody else. If that's true, the demand for the loanable funds, the demand for the water is going up, the price of that is going to go up, and so we'd say private investment will fall because there's less money available in the water well, and so there is less private borrowing, right? Less private borrowing. Now, in practice, Keynesians would say that that realistically in a recession there's not very much private borrowing to begin with, and so there's more water in the well than we really need, right? That in fact there's lots of water in the well not even being used in a recession, so we wouldn't worry about it. The other evidence that we have suggests that perhaps the effect is maybe overstated in terms of countries like the United States. We'll return to this concept in a later unit, next unit in fact. But suffice it to say that it's a reason why aggregate demand might not go up as you might think, because even though you're increasing spending or what have you, the amount of private investment is going to go down and consumption, because they're not going to borrow that money to finance the purchases. The last one here, net exports effects. This is the same idea, but it's saying if you increase government spending, okay, and you had AD and SRAS to fix that recession, right? You move AD up to AD1, that price levels are going to go up when you do that, okay? And as the price level rises, U.S. goods become more expensive, so foreign countries buy less, so the net exports go down. And so if you think maybe that your aggregate demand might go up by 100 because you increased your spending by 100, maybe you lose 10 worth of net exports, and so your actual increase is only 90. So these are two reasons why AD might not go up as much as you would think when you're using these kinds of policies. So hopefully this helps you make sense of the introduction of fiscal policy, and I'll see you next time.